"You know what's funny?" my wife said, lifting her wine glass while 20 people watched. "Ethan still thinks hard work matters more than success." The laughter hit the table before the wine did. Some people chuckled politely. Others laughed because Rachel laughed. And Rachel had become the kind of woman people followed. I remember the sound more than the words. Not loud, not cruel, just comfortable. The kind of laughter that comes when everyone in the room agrees on who the joke is. I sat there with a glass of bourbon in my hand and watched the ice slowly turn in circles. Nobody noticed I wasn't smiling. Nobody noticed I wasn't laughing either. The country club ballroom glowed beneath crystal chandeliers the size of pickup trucks. Waiters moved through the crowd carrying trays of appetizers. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Dallas skyline shimmered against the Texas night. Inside, everything smelled expensive. The food, the perfume, the confidence. Rachel belonged there. At least that's what everyone believed. She stood near the center of the room wearing a dark emerald dress that caught the light every time she moved. People gathered around her naturally. Executives, investors, department heads. She had spent the last 10 years climbing higher and higher in her company, and tonight was another celebration of that success. I should have been proud. Maybe a part of me still was, but pride and disappointment can sit at the same table. Trust me. I know. "Come on, Rachel." One of her coworkers laughed. "Don't be too hard on the guy." More laughter followed. Rachel grinned. "I'm serious. Ethan's the most relaxed man in Texas. The world could end tomorrow and he'd still be sitting on the porch drinking coffee." The group laughed again. Someone raised a glass. Someone repeated the joke. The sound rolled across the room like a wave. I took another sip of bourbon. Tasted smooth going down and bitter afterward. Funny thing is, none of them actually knew me. Not really. They knew the version Rachel talked about. The quiet husband. The invisible husband. The man who stopped chasing ambition years ago. They looked at me and saw a middle-aged guy in a simple navy suit standing alone near the edge of the room. What they didn't see was the life behind that suit. What they didn't know was that 15 years earlier, I had walked away from a world they spent every day trying to enter. But that's getting ahead of myself. Back then, sitting in that ballroom, all I could hear was Rachel's laughter. It echoed through the room again as someone made another joke at my expense. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look uncomfortable. She didn't try to change the subject. She simply laughed. Maybe that's what hurt the most. Not the joke. Not the people. Her. The woman who once sat beside me on the floor of our first apartment eating takeout from paper containers because we couldn't afford furniture. The woman who used to squeeze my hand beneath restaurant tables when nobody was looking. Somewhere along the way, that woman disappeared. In her place stood someone I barely recognized. I rolled the glass between my fingers and watched the amber liquid catch the light. The ice clicked softly against the crystal. A small sound, almost lost beneath the laughter. Looking back now, that was the moment everything changed. Not when the truth came out. Not when the room went silent. Not when people finally realized who I was. No. Started right there. With a laugh. A simple laugh that everyone else forgot before the night was over. But I never forgot it. Because sometimes a marriage doesn't break with a fight. Sometimes it breaks with a smile. The laughter eventually drifted toward another conversation. Another joke. Another glass of wine. That is the thing about moments like that. The people who create them rarely remember them. The people who live through them never forget. I stood near the edge of the ballroom and watched the city lights beyond the windows. Dallas stretched across the horizon in rivers of white and gold. Traffic moved slowly along the highways. Airplanes blinked in the distance. The world kept moving as if nothing had happened. Maybe that was why I stayed calm. I learned a long time ago that emotions are expensive. Once you spend them, you do not get them back. Rachel used to admire that about me. Back when we first met, she called it confidence. Years later, she called it a lack of ambition. Funny how the same trait can look different depending on who is judging it. A waiter passed by carrying a tray of sparkling water. I traded my empty glass for a fresh drink and nodded my thanks. The condensation felt cold against my palm. Across the room, Rachel was surrounded by coworkers again. She looked happy, comfortable, certain of her place in the world. Watching her now, nobody would have guessed we had been married for nearly 18 years. Nobody would have guessed how ordinary our story started. We met in Austin when she was 22 and I was 26. She was working her first real corporate job. I was already building something that consumed every waking hour of my life. Back then, neither of us had much money. We shared cheap meals, drove used cars, and dreamed about futures that seemed impossibly far away. Those years felt simple, honest. We were partners. At least I thought we were. The strange thing is that people often assume they know my story when they look at me. They see a quiet man in his 40s. They see someone who rarely talks about work. Someone who leaves meetings early and ignores social media. Someone who seems completely uninterested in proving himself. What they do not understand is that I spent most of my 30s proving myself. I spent years chasing growth, chasing numbers, chasing opportunities. I slept in airports, missed holidays, worked weekends. There was a time when 70-hour workweeks felt normal. There was a time when my phone never stopped ringing. There was a time when success was the only thing I could see. Then one day I stepped away, not because I failed, not because I had to, because I chose to. Most people never understood that decision. Rachel least of all. Over the years she stopped asking why. Eventually she stopped caring. To her coworkers, I became a harmless mystery. To her friends, I became a running joke. To Rachel, I slowly became background noise. Looking back, the signs were everywhere. The interrupted conversations when I entered a room. The jokes that grew a little sharper each year. The introductions that became shorter and less enthusiastic. It happened so gradually that I almost convinced myself it was normal. Almost. Across the ballroom, Rachel laughed again. The sound carried through the crowd and landed somewhere deep in my chest. I took a slow sip of water and watched the reflections dance across the glass. What nobody in that room realized was that the story they believed about me was built on an assumption. And assumptions have a way of collapsing when reality finally walks through the door. The truth is, I never planned to tell anyone. Not Rachel. Not her friends. Not the people standing in that ballroom pretending they understood my life. 15 years earlier, I had learned a lesson most people never do. The more money involved, the less attention you want. Back then I was 30 years old, exhausted, and living on coffee that tasted like burnt cardboard. My days started before sunrise and ended long after midnight. There were months when I slept on office couches more often than I slept at home. The company began in a rented warehouse outside Austin. 1,200 square feet. Leaky roof. Folding tables from a liquidation sale. 3 employees if you counted me. 4 if you counted the golden retriever that wandered in one afternoon and never left. We were building software nobody thought would matter. Investors laughed. Competitors ignored us. Banks politely declined every loan application. Looking back, I understand why. Most startups disappear within a few years. Most founders burn through savings and return to normal jobs. Statistically speaking, failure was the safest prediction. But statistics do not account for obsession. We grew slowly at first. Then suddenly, 1 contract became 5. 5 became 20. Revenue climbed. New offices opened. Venture capital firms started calling instead of ignoring us. For a while I enjoyed it. The interviews, the conferences, the articles. People shook my hand differently when they thought I was important. Then something strange happened. The bigger the company became, the less I recognized my own life. Every conversation turned into numbers. Every relationship felt transactional. Every room was filled with people trying to become the smartest person in it. One night I sat alone in a hotel overlooking San Francisco Bay and realized I was more successful than I had ever imagined and less happy than I had ever admitted. So I made a decision nobody understood. I stepped away from daily operations and transferred leadership to people I trusted. The ownership structure changed. New agreements were signed. Layers were created between my name and the company itself. Publicly, I disappeared. Privately, I remained exactly where I had always been. Most people assumed I sold everything. Others assumed I failed. I never corrected them. Silence is easier than explanation. Rachel knew pieces of that story. Not all of it. In the beginning, she accepted my decision. She said she supported whatever made me happy. At the time, I believed her. Years passed. Her career accelerated. Promotions arrived. New circles formed around her. People who measured success by job titles and corner offices. People who could not understand why a man would voluntarily walk away from the spotlight. Eventually, their questions became her questions. Then their judgments became hers. Standing in that ballroom years later, I watched her laughing beside people who thought they had me figured out. They saw a quiet husband, a man without ambition, a footnote in his wife's success story. What none of them realized was that the company they admired from business magazines and market reports was still connected to me in ways they could not imagine. And before the night was over, the first crack in their version of reality was about to appear. The first signs were small enough to ignore. That is usually how these things begin. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to erase years of respect. It happens inch by inch, conversation by conversation, joke by joke. Rachel used to introduce me differently. Years ago, she would smile when she said my name. She would tell people about the business I built, about the risks we took when we were young, about the years when success was nothing more than an idea scribbled on legal pads and whiteboards. Then the descriptions started getting shorter. Ethan works from home. Ethan is taking it easy these days. Ethan likes a slower pace. Harmless words on the surface. But words matter. They shape perception. Eventually people stopped asking questions because they assumed they already knew the answers. I remember a dinner party 3 years earlier at a steakhouse overlooking White Rock Lake. One of Rachel's colleagues asked what I did for a living. Before I could answer, Rachel laughed softly and said, "Mostly he enjoys retirement before retirement." Everyone smiled. I smiled too. At the time, it seemed insignificant. Looking back, it was not. Moments like that multiplied. At networking events, holiday parties, charity fundraisers. Every year, another layer disappeared from the story. Every year, I became a little smaller in the eyes of the people around her. The strange thing is that I never fought back. Partly because I did not care what strangers thought. Partly because I believed Rachel would eventually remember who I was. That was my mistake. We tell ourselves people see us clearly because they love us. Sometimes they only see the version that fits their current life. Rachel's world became bigger, louder, faster. Her phone never stopped buzzing. Her calendar looked like an airport departure board. Breakfast meetings, leadership conferences, corporate retreats, industry awards. Success followed her everywhere she went. And I was genuinely happy for her. I celebrated every promotion, every achievement, every milestone. But somewhere along the way, gratitude turned into comparison. Comparison turned into judgment. Judgment turned into embarrassment. The hardest part was not what she said. It was what she stopped saying. She stopped asking for advice. Stopped sharing concerns. Stopped treating me like a partner. We lived in the same house but occupied different worlds. Some evenings she would come home and spend an hour talking about executives I had never met while barely asking how my day went. Other nights she would scroll through her phone while I sat across from her at the kitchen table. The silence between us grew so gradually that neither of us acknowledged it. Yet I felt it, every day, like a draft coming through a crack in a window. Standing in that ballroom, I watched Rachel speaking with a group of senior managers. Her smile flashed beneath the chandelier lights. They admired her, respected her, followed her. And as I watched them laughing together, I realized something that should have been obvious years earlier. Rachel no longer saw me as the man who built something extraordinary. She saw me as the man who walked away from it. To her, those were not the same person. What she did not understand was that the story she believed about me was built on missing information. And missing information has a way of becoming very expensive when the truth finally arrives. By 9 o'clock, the ballroom had grown louder. Conversations overlapped. Glasses clinked. Laughter drifted between tables like background music. The annual gala was one of the biggest events Rachel's company hosted each year. Senior leadership attended. Investors attended. Board members attended. The kind of night where careers quietly moved forward or backward depending on who noticed you. Rachel thrived in environments like that. She always had. I watched her move through the room with effortless confidence, greeting people by name, remembering details about their families, making everyone feel important. It was one of the reasons I fell in love with her all those years ago. It was also one of the reasons what happened next hurt more than it should have. A group of executives gathered near one of the corner tables overlooking the city. Rachel joined them. A few minutes later, someone waved me over. I considered staying where I was. Instead, I walked across the ballroom. The carpet softened every footstep. The skyline glittered beyond the glass. When I reached the group, Rachel was already smiling. "There he is," one man said. "The mystery husband." A few people laughed. I smiled politely. Another executive adjusted his cufflinks and looked at me. "Rachel tells us you have life figured out. No stress. No meetings. No deadlines." More laughter followed. Rachel shook her head and raised her drink. "Trust me, if there is a secret formula for avoiding responsibility, Ethan mastered it years ago." The group laughed again. Not maliciously, not openly cruel, just enough. The same comfortable laughter I had heard earlier. The kind that only happens when people assume everyone shares the same opinion. I felt the cold surface of my water glass against my fingertips. The condensation slid slowly down the side. Nobody noticed. Rachel continued talking. Story after story. Joke after joke. Every one of them painted the same picture. Ethan the retired husband. Ethan the relaxed husband. Ethan the man who stopped chasing success. Standing there, I realized something. None of these people actually disliked me. They simply believed the version of me Rachel had spent years presenting. That realization made the room feel strangely quiet despite the noise surrounding us. Then another voice entered the conversation. Richard Monroe, the company's chief executive officer. I recognized him immediately. Tall, silver hair, expensive suit. The kind of executive whose photograph appeared in financial magazines several times a year. He joined the circle carrying a glass of champagne. Rachel straightened slightly when she saw him. Everyone did. Richard smiled at the group before looking toward me. "And this must be Ethan." I nodded. "Good to meet you." His handshake was firm, professional, brief. For a moment his eyes lingered on mine. Not long enough for anyone else to notice. Just long enough for something unexpected to register. Recognition. It disappeared almost instantly, but I saw it. Years of business meetings had taught me how to read people. Richard knew something, or thought he did. Before I could process it, one of the executives laughed and gestured toward me. "You should hire Ethan, Richard. Apparently he has mastered the art of doing absolutely nothing." The group erupted again. Rachel laughed the loudest. I lowered my eyes to the glass in my hand. The ice shifted softly against the side. Across the room a phone began to ring. At the time it seemed meaningless. Looking back, that sound marked the beginning of the end of every assumption in that ballroom. The ringing phone came from Richard Monroe's jacket pocket. At first nobody paid attention. Conversations continued. Glasses clinked. Someone laughed at a joke from across the room. Richard glanced at the screen and his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Most people would have missed it. I did not. Years of negotiations taught me that the smallest reactions often reveal the biggest problems. He excused himself with a polite nod and stepped away from the group. The conversation around me resumed immediately. Rachel was already talking to someone else. Whatever curiosity Richard's departure might have created vanished within seconds. That is how large events work. People notice movement but rarely question it. I watched him cross the ballroom toward a quieter hallway near the conference rooms. He answered the call before disappearing around the corner. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The city lights reflected against the glass walls. A jazz band played softly near the stage. Dinner service began. Yet something felt different. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just different. The kind of feeling you get when the weather changes before the clouds arrive. I stayed where I was, listening more than speaking. Rachel remained surrounded by coworkers. Every now and then I caught fragments of conversation. Quarterly projections. Promotions. Expansion plans. Executive reshuffles. The language of corporate ambition. Then Richard returned. The change in him was impossible to ignore now. His smile looked forced. His movements seemed tighter. He shook a few hands, answered a few questions, but his attention kept drifting elsewhere. Several times his eyes found me across the room. Each glance lasted only a second. Each one left him looking more unsettled. Eventually, one of the executives noticed. "Everything okay, Richard?" The question sounded casual. Richard nodded too quickly. "Fine. Just handling a situation." He reached for a glass of water instead of champagne. Another detail. Small, but unusual. The executives exchanged brief looks before moving on. Rachel did not seem to notice anything at all. She was telling another story. Another joke. Another version of who Ethan Walker supposedly was. Across the ballroom, a woman from investor relations approached Richard carrying a tablet. They spoke quietly. Whatever appeared on the screen caused the color to drain from his face for a moment. He recovered quickly, but not quickly enough. I saw it. So did she. The woman looked toward me afterward. Then back to Richard. Then toward me again. That was when I knew. Somewhere outside this ballroom, information was moving. Documents. Messages. Conversations. Pieces of a puzzle connecting in real time. What nobody around us realized was that tonight was not supposed to unfold this way. The event had its own schedule, its own script, awards, speeches, celebrations. But reality has a habit of interrupting scripts. A few minutes later, Richard began walking directly toward me. The crowd parted naturally as he crossed the room. His expression was professional but strained. Rachel finally noticed and smiled proudly. She probably assumed the chief executive officer wanted a quick conversation with her husband out of courtesy. Several co-workers turned to watch. The room did not fall silent. Not yet. But attention started gathering around us like storm clouds forming over open land. Richard stopped a few feet away. For a moment he simply looked at me. Then he offered a careful smile and said, "Mr. Walker, I believe we need to talk." The air around us suddenly felt much heavier than it had a minute earlier. For a second, nobody said anything. The music continued. Glasses clinked somewhere behind us. Yet the atmosphere around our small circle shifted in a way everyone could feel. Richard Monroe stood in front of me with the careful expression of a man walking across thin ice. Rachel glanced between us, confused but still smiling. "You two know each other?" she asked. Richard did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on me. "Not personally," he said at last. "At least not until tonight." The response only deepened the confusion. Around us, conversations began slowing down. People sensed something unusual unfolding. Human nature is funny that way. We notice tension before we understand it. Richard took a slow breath. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Walker." Several heads turned. Rachel blinked. "An apology?" she repeated. Richard nodded. "I should have recognized you sooner." The silence that followed felt heavier than any speech. Rachel laughed nervously. "I think there has been some misunderstanding." Richard looked at her, then back at me. "No misunderstanding." He swallowed once. "The call I just received came from our board chairman." I watched Rachel's smile begin to fade. Not disappear, just weaken slightly around the edges. Richard continued carefully. "There was a discussion this afternoon involving ownership records connected to one of our largest institutional stakeholders. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. The room seemed to lean closer. During that conversation, Richard said, your name came up. Rachel stared at him. The executives surrounding us exchanged uncertain looks. One of them tried to laugh. Wait, Ethan owns stock. Richard shook his head slowly. Not stock. Another pause. Another crack forming beneath the surface. Control. The word landed quietly, but its effect was immediate. I could almost hear people processing it. Rachel's eyes found mine. For the first time that night, she was not amused. She was searching, looking for an explanation, looking for the version of reality she still understood. Richard continued. 15 years ago, a trust structure was established during a series of acquisitions. The ownership chain became extremely private. Most of us never knew who ultimately controlled the voting interests. His voice grew more careful with every sentence. Tonight I learned that the individual holding those interests is Ethan Walker. The silence spread outward like ripples across still water. One executive nearly dropped his drink. Another stared at me as though I had become a different person in the span of 30 seconds. Rachel looked pale beneath the ballroom lights. That is not possible, she whispered. Nobody answered her, because deep down everyone understood the same thing. Richard would never make a statement like that unless he was absolutely certain. The years of assumptions, the jokes, the dismissive introductions, the comfortable laughter, all of it suddenly looked fragile. Richard straightened his jacket. For what it is worth, Mr. Walker, the board chairman asked me to personally express his appreciation. The company would not exist in its current form without the decisions you made years ago. I looked around the room. Every face had changed. Not dramatically, just enough. Respect where there had been amusement. Uncertainty where there had been confidence. Rachel stood frozen beside me. Earlier that evening she had laughed with people who thought I had accomplished nothing. Now those same people could barely meet my eyes. And the strangest part was that the night was only beginning. Nobody knew what to say after that. The ballroom remained full of people, yet the noise seemed distant now, as if someone had lowered the volume on the entire evening. Richard stepped aside after offering another apology. Several executives immediately approached him with questions, but their attention kept drifting back toward me. The shift was almost uncomfortable. Earlier they had treated me like a harmless footnote. Now they were looking at me as though I held answers to questions they had never thought to ask. Rachel stood beside me in complete silence. For years I had imagined what this moment might feel like. Vindication, satisfaction, maybe even triumph. Instead I felt tired, deeply tired, because the revelation had not changed who I was. It had only changed what other people believed about me. Rachel finally spoke. Why did you never tell me? Her voice was quiet, fragile in a way I had not heard for a long time. I looked at the skyline beyond the glass. The city lights remained steady. Cars moved along the highways. Somewhere below, ordinary people were finishing dinners, driving home, living lives untouched by boardrooms and corporate politics. I did tell you, I said softly. Years ago. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Not this. I nodded. No. Not this. The difference mattered. Years earlier she had known enough to understand who I was. She simply stopped believing it mattered. Around us, conversations slowly restarted. Yet the atmosphere never returned to what it had been. People became careful with their words. Jokes disappeared. Laughter became measured. One executive who had mocked me earlier stopped by to apologize. Another offered his business card. A third asked if we could have lunch sometime. The reactions blurred together. Respect arriving after discovery always feels different from respect given freely. Rachel watched all of it happen. Every handshake, every nervous smile, every awkward attempt to rewrite the last few hours. I could almost see the realization settling over her. Not because of money, not because of ownership structures, because she was finally seeing how much of her perception had been built on assumptions. The hardest truth was not that I had been successful. The hardest truth was that nothing about me had changed between dinner and dessert. I was the same man she had laughed at earlier, the same man sitting beside her at breakfast, the same man she barely looked at when scrolling through her phone. Yet suddenly the room treated me differently. That difference said more about them than it did about me. Rachel reached for my arm. The gesture felt familiar and distant at the same time. "Ethan," she said, "can we talk after this?" I studied her face. For the first time in years, there was no confidence there. No certainty, just concern. Maybe even regret. I gave a small nod. Of course. But deep inside, something had already shifted. Not because she laughed. Not because the truth came out. Because I finally understood that the gap between us had become larger than either of us wanted to admit. The revelation in the ballroom had exposed more than a hidden ownership structure. It had exposed the reality of our marriage. And unlike corporate records, some things cannot be corrected with paperwork once they have been neglected for too long. The conversation Rachel and I had that night lasted nearly 3 hours. Not in the ballroom. Not in front of executives or investors. We talked at home after midnight while the city slept outside our windows. The house felt strangely quiet. For years silence had lived between us, but this silence was different. Honest. Uncomfortable. Necessary. Rachel sat across from me at the kitchen table where we had shared thousands of meals over nearly 2 decades. The overhead light cast soft shadows across the room. Neither of us touched the coffee growing cold between us. She asked questions. I answered them. Then I asked questions of my own. Some were difficult. Some had no good answers. The truth rarely arrives all at once. Comes in pieces. One realization after another. By sunrise, we both understood something neither of us wanted to admit. The problem had never been success. The problem had been respect. Somewhere along the way, we stopped seeing each other clearly. We spent the following months trying to repair what had been neglected. Counseling. Honest conversations. New habits. Real effort from both sides. Some things improved. Others did not. Sometimes two people can care deeply about each other and still recognize they are no longer walking in the same direction. A year later, we finalized an amicable divorce. No courtroom battles. No public drama. Just two adults accepting a difficult truth with as much grace as possible. People always expect a dramatic ending when they hear stories like this. They expect revenge. They expect humiliation. They expect someone to lose everything. Real life rarely works that way. Rachel did not lose everything. Neither did I. What we lost was the version of our marriage that had already been fading long before that gala. Life moved forward. It always does. These days I live outside Austin on a quiet piece of land overlooking a small lake. Most mornings begin the same way. Coffee on the porch. Sunrise reflecting across the water. A phone that rings far less often than it used to. The company continues to grow under capable leadership. I still participate when necessary, but from a distance. Exactly the way I prefer it. Sometimes reporters reach out asking for interviews. Most of the time I decline. Privacy becomes valuable once you learn how little public attention actually matters. A few months ago, I was reading a business magazine when I came across an article featuring Rachel. She had accepted a leadership position at another firm and was doing well. The photograph showed her standing confidently in a modern office tower overlooking downtown Dallas. I smiled when I saw it. Not because of regret. Not because of satisfaction. Because despite everything, I was genuinely happy she had found her own path. Looking back now, people often ask what changed that night. They assume the answer involves money or power or hidden ownership records. It does not. The real change happened much earlier. The moment I stopped needing other people to recognize my value. Success that depends on applause is fragile. Respect that depends on status is temporary. The strongest foundations are built much deeper than that. Sometimes the quietest person in the room carries the largest story. Sometimes the person everyone overlooks has already achieved everything they were trying to prove. And sometimes a single evening reveals truths that have been standing in plain sight all along. The lake outside my porch catches the morning sunlight now the same way it did yesterday. The water remains calm. The sky remains wide. And for the first time in many years, so does my life.